Good afternoon. My name is Colonel Tom Gordon, and I've been leading Marines for 30 years. Today, I have the privilege of serving as a director to the Marine Corps Command and Staff College here in Quantico, Virginia. First, I'd like to thank Franklin and the National Guard Bureau for pulling this event together. I'm excited to hear some of the other presenters. I'm a big fan of David Robertson. We had him out here at the Marine Corps University last year, and he did not disappoint. Last May, in the midst of a global pandemic, a looming economic recession, and a crisis of confidence in our leaders and institutions, I published a piece titled The Invincible Man. It was on Stoicism and its practical application in the military. Additionally, I have a book coming out this spring titled Marine Maxims, 50 Lessons on How to Turn Principles into Practice, in which Stoic philosophy is woven throughout. Finally, here at the Command and Staff College, I supplement the curriculum with 17 sessions on leadership. Here, I introduce the future battalion and squadron commanders of the Joint Force to the tenets of Stoic philosophy. My talk this morning will be on two products of Stoicism, resiliency and resolve, and the military necessity to inculcate these virtues in our future leaders. In his book, The Anatomy of Courage, Lord Moran, a frontline surgeon in the Great War, and Churchill's personal physician in World War II, wrote, "A man is like a fine suit. He will eventually wear out." Now, leaving men exposed to prolonged combat is actually a 20th century phenomenon. Army psychologist David Grossman said that the United States during the Great War did this to as many as 80 consecutive days. Now, leaving men exposed to continuous combat can outstrip their psychiatric capabilities to endure it. As we enter another period of great power competition, this is important to remember. Will and will alone has decided every major battle since antiquity. Paraphrasing our 18th Commandant, at some point, someone decides that they have lost. And when they do, they are right. Now, last year, we brought out Major General Glavey. He's a CG of Marine Forces Cyber Command to address the Command and Staff College. During his lecture, he alluded to his capability, or his ability rather, to deliver 10-digit grid quality IO, or information operations. So for the non-targeteers out there in the audience, a 10-digit grid is within a meter of accuracy. But that's not what the general was referring to. He was actually alluding to a far tighter shot placement. He was alluding to the 6 inches between an adversary's ears. If we agree that defeat is a cognitive outcome, and we agree that will is decided all battles, should we not assume then that our adversaries have a similar capability? If we were to flip this chessboard around, we have to admit that we are vulnerable to manipulation. Our adversaries will attack our will to fight by means of sophisticated influence operations, the likes of which we have never seen before. So how then do we build a consistency of character that makes it impossible for an adversary to do us harm? How do we build that emotional and spiritual parapet resilient to the targeted strikes against our confidence and our will to fight? Here at the Command and Staff College, I present a Stoic philosophy as a series of coping techniques, a form of spiritual jiu-jitsu, if you will, that enables the practitioner to redirect a blow and control their response irrespective of their circumstances. For example, when discussing post-traumatic stress, General Mattis would often turn the discussion into one on post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is an exercise in spiritual wellness. Now, as military professionals, we are comfortable designing training programs to improve physical fitness, right? Our professional military education continuum is designed to develop the mental acuity required to pierce the fog of war and find clarity of purpose in the chaos of combat. But where do we go to improve spiritual health? How do we develop that consistency of character that is impervious to disease, despair, or even defeat? And how can we discuss spiritual fitness without proselytizing? Now, one of the many benefits of working here in Quantico is we share this reservation with the FBI Academy. Here at the Command and Staff College, we have an FBI chair who introduced me to some of the great work being done by Don Bostic out there at the FBI Academy, teaching spiritual fitness to future FBI agents. Now, by the time one enters the military, or the FBI for that matter, their personal code, their belief system, or the religion should be developed well enough that they can calibrate their own moral compass. And I am not suggesting replacing anyone's faith. Rather, I'm offering Stoicism as an alternative framework that can overlay and make one's own belief system more resilient. In what is described as a post-honor society, Michael Evans, writing in the United States Naval War College Review, also offers Stoicism as an alternative moral philosophy to underpin our professional military ethos. I use Admiral Stockdale to make my case for the military application of Stoicism. For those unfamiliar with his story, let me begin back in September 9th, back in 1965. Stockdale was flying an A-5 Skyhawk on a bombing run over North Vietnam. There, he was shot down when bad weather forced him to divert below the clouds and attack a secondary target. The secondary target was a line of Chinese boxcars guarded by a Soviet twin 57mm anti-aircraft gun. He was able to eject, and while floating down into enemy territory, he had a moment to reflect and mentally prepare himself for the horrors that undoubtedly way ahead. He said, "I'm leaving this world and entering the world of Epictetus." Now, I assume this group is pretty familiar with Epictetus and probably can appreciate why a naval aviator would call out his name in his time of greatest need. Prior to deploying to Vietnam, Stockdale was given a copy of Epictetus' teachings and was introduced to Stoic philosophy while completing his master's at Stanford. Under the mentorship of philosophy professor and World War II veteran, Dr. Philip Reinhardt, Stockdale found a strong belief system in the Stoic teachings. Here, he discovered what it meant to be invincible. The invincible man, Stockdale, quoting Epictetus, professed, is one who cannot be dismayed by happenings outside of his control. Now, as a prisoner of war, Stockdale learned that invincible did not mean impervious. He and his fellow POWs were routinely broken by the tormentors. Yet they were able to spiritually regroup and continue to persist day after day. Stockdale had the mentality and the spirituality to prepare himself prior to deployment, however. The point is, just like teaching someone how to do push-ups or teaching them how to do pull-ups, spiritual wellness can be taught and it can be developed. There are lots of great lessons that we can take from the Hanoi Hilton. It's a phenomenal case study. Think about it. Hundreds of airmen and naval aviators and a few special operations personnel spent close to a decade there. The prison was home to some paragons of virtue and resolve. John McCain, General Boyd, Admiral Stockdale. They say that the first prisoner at the Hanoi Hilton was Everett Alvarez. Alvarez was a naval aviator and was the son of a Mexican immigrant. He spent 9.5 years before being repatriated. When he was repatriated, however, he came back home and was able to have a successful life and a career. Now, back then, the fate of these POWs was a hot topic at the Paris Peace Accords. They captured the hearts of the American people and were discussed regularly on the evening news. President Nixon and Kissinger were extremely concerned what would happen when these prisoners were repatriated after being systematically tortured for nearly a decade. Kissinger was actually able to negotiate the release of 20 POWs as part of the peace talks. Remarkably, these 20 POWs refused early release and delayed their return in order to deny the North Vietnamese a propaganda opportunity, if you will. Now, Dr. William Sledge was fascinated by the resiliency, and he commissioned a study into these POWs. He was following the POWs after their repatriation. He found that 4% of the residents of the Hanoi Hilton actually suffered from PTSD upon their return. Now, juxtapose that to as high as 30% infection rate for those Vietnam vets that saw ground combat. In their book, Leadership Lessons of the Hanoi Hilton, Fretwell and Kinlan attribute these remarkably low numbers to Admiral Stockdale's leadership and the POW culture he was able to form. Through a secret tap code, Stockdale was able to impart Stoic philosophy concepts such as empathy and resolve. He didn't do this, though, through lecturing. He did it through his personal example. So what Stoic philosophy did Stockdale practice as a prisoner of war, and what can we learn from it? Well, first, there was subjective consciousness, or the ability to distinguish what is in your power and what is not. This was critical to their spiritual wellness. They, as I mentioned, were not supermen. The Stoics feel pain, they feel loss, and they suffer. However, it is their response to these external forces that distinguish their character. Stockdale demonstrated that the only agency he retained was how he responded to his tormentors. Second, cognitive distancing. Now, known in the field of psychology as emotive behavioral therapy, this theory holds that people's interpretation of events determines their reaction. A Stoic would say that it is not the event that upsets us, but it's our judgment about said event that does us harm. For example, the Stoics believe that fear of pain does more damage than the pain itself. For fear of pain can injure your character. Now, the North Vietnamese extortionists used ropes to force agonizing stress positions upon the POWs, inflicting traumatic injury to their joints and their tendons. Preparing to face the ropes, as Stockdale called it, he learned to control his fear. Now, the lessons of the Hanoi Hilton are ripe with paradox. The Stockdale paradox, made famous by Jim Collins in his book Good to Great, is actually Stockdale borrowing from Viktor Frankl, who I will discuss next. Stockdale declared, "You must maintain unwavering faith that you can and will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. But at the same time, have the discipline to confront the most brutal facts in your current reality, whatever they may be." Now, this is actually the paradox of acceptance. By accepting the discomfort and experience, by accepting discomfort and they actually experience, they being the POWs, less suffering. By being indifferent to indifferent things, the prisoners were able to channel their resolve onto things that they could affect. Stockdale and his fellow prisoners accepted their fate and stopped struggling against the things that they couldn't control, because doing so did more harm than good. And finally, and most importantly, the POWs found purpose in Stoicism. After coaching and mentoring a fellow captive and helping him restore his spiritual wellness via a tap code session, Stockdale would remind himself that he was exactly where he belonged. Stockdale found great purpose in his suffering and being a POW. Alfred Whitehead, he was an English mathematician and a philosopher, once wrote, "A moral education is impossible without the habitual visions of greatness." Now, the students at the the Naval War College from 1977 to 1979 and the Citadel from 1979 to 1980 did not have that problem. No, they did not have to look far, I should say, for an inspirational example to emulate. Their college president spent 7.5 years as a POW in North Vietnam. James Bond Stockdale was repatriated to the United States in 1973 after the Paris Peace Accords ended the U.S. involvement in the war. In 1976, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his courageous leadership and his personal sacrifices while in captivity. Though crippled from his wounds, he was promoted to Vice Admiral and allowed to complete his career as the president of the Naval War College until his retirement in 1979. As the president of the Naval War College, he taught a course titled The Foundations of Moral Obligation. The course later became known simply as the Stockdale course. The course was most popular amongst the students. Here, within the halls of Newport, he was able to introduce aspiring naval officers to Stoic philosophy and explained how it saved his life and preserved his honor in Vietnam. Now, the most powerful book I ever read was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl was a Holocaust survivor and a psychologist and a Stoic. Frankl's thesis held that life is not a quest for pleasure, but it's a quest for meaning. His seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning, describes how he survived the concentration camp and assisted others through his psychiatric method titled logotherapy. Frankl is said to have discovered his answer in the Nazi concentration camp when he learned that he was in fact asking the wrong question. It is not, what do I want from life, he discovered. It is actually, what does life want from me? Where do my talents and my gladness meet the world's needs? So jump forward a couple of decades and John Boyd. So Colonel John Boyd, United States Air Force, probably the most famous airman to a United States Marine. He's got a great speech out there that I recommend everyone, if they're not familiar with it, you can Google it up. Just Google John Boyd to be or to do. See, Boyd spent his final years in the Pentagon vocally dissenting and bucking his service headquarters. He walked the halls of the building, recruiting like-minded junior officers to join his quest for change. Having already been passed over for promotion himself, Boyd was careful to make sure that those that were following him understood the cost of his rebellion, of joining his rebellion. He offered each a choice. You could either be somebody, be recognized by the system and be promoted, or you could do something that would be impactful to the service and to the defense of the nation. See, if we think about it, the literal definition of passion actually means to suffer. Here, the Stoic tenets offer an introspective search for real purpose. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." So the first step in building resiliency and resolve, therefore, is actually a spiritual health assessment, right? To have spiritual wellness, you first and foremost, and most importantly, have to have a purpose. And as a leader, you must be able to imbue this purpose throughout the entire organization. So let's get practical. How do you actually then inculcate this? How do you inculcate your command against the stresses of combat? It's actually not rocket science, right? To build resiliency, you build resiliency by overcoming adversity. Wash, rinse, repeat. Stockdale attributed his resiliency in part to his experiencing overcoming adversity as a plebe at the Naval Academy. Now, embrace the suck was a catchphrase I perhaps overused in command. More than a training philosophy, it's actually one of my maxims on building resiliency in my book. Seneca the Younger wrote, "Disaster is virtue's opportunity." The truth is, true character can't be revealed without adversity. So whether you're quoting Seneca or you're quoting Ecclesiastes in the New Testament, remember, just as gold is tried by fire, a man is by misfortune. The truth is, we in the profession of arms have shared a degree of misery that the protected will never know. But we also know that suffering is where goodness comes from. Marines want it hard, and they're disappointed when it's not. But there are a few rules that we all have to recognize here. First and foremost, this suffering, it has to have a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, it's going to have the exact opposite effect you're looking for. Second, the suffering should never be the purpose, right? It was never intentional. I never designed training to be miserable. But then again, I never intervened when it was. We always allowed the training evolution to complete. We always completed the mission and let the training evolution run its course. Now, we have to make sure here that there's a clear line between demanding training and hazing. Remember, the fortitude of the unit is actually the aggregated will of the individual. See, unity is forged, not forced. Not my line. I'm borrowing from Posner. This is a direct lift out of his book called The Leadership Challenge. I don't know if General Krulak read his book, but General Krulak, when he was the commandant, directed that we revamp recruit training. I was actually a company commander down in Paris Island back in 1995 and had the privilege of leading a recruit training company through the beta test that would become the Crucible. That first Crucible was everything the commandant envisioned. It was a grueling gut trek, 54 hours, sleep deprivation, food deprivation, and push those recruits to their absolute limit. That was that culminating event that the commandant envisioned. Now, in September of 2016, my son Shane completed the Crucible with platoon 3072. After hearing his Crucible C stories, I'm proud to say that the system and the bonds that it creates are as strong as they were 20 years ago. For those unfamiliar with the Royal Marines, I am not condoning or advocating some of their shenanigans, but their culture is uniquely effective. While the other services and our allies have been plagued with an epidemic of suicide in the ranks, the Royal Marines appear impervious, or immune at least. Why is that? I propose it has a lot to do with one of their leadership principles, called cheer in the face of adversity. Now, Royal Marines and United States Marines alike are known for their morose and often dark sense of humor. Situation miserable, crack a joke. As a commander, I found humor to be a highly effective leadership tool during stressful times, but it needs to be employed wisely. Authenticity and emotional intelligence are far more important than the timing. In fact, it's actually the timing, or the poor timing, I should say, of the joke in a crisis that makes it resonate with Marines. Marines want it tough, but they're also not afraid to laugh regardless of the circumstances. These emotions, they're contagious. Another great book I will commend to you is Primal Leadership, Realizing the Power of Emotional Intelligence by Goldman. He found that there was great diffusion by use of cheer through the ranks. This all speaks to emotional intelligence and how attuned a particular commander is, to what will resonate with his Marines. I take you back to the story of Chesty Puller when he was a regimental commander in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. They were surrounded by 8 Chinese divisions in the middle of a brutal winter. Chet, when he received this report that they were completely surrounded, Chesty Puller allegedly retorted, "All right, they're to our left and our right, they're in front of us and they're behind us. They can't get away this time." So I wanted to wrap up with a couple of TTPs and final thoughts. So TTPs, apologize for the acronym, military parlance for tactics, techniques, and procedures. So how do we properly train Marines to prepare them for combat? How do we build this resiliency and the resolve? Well, simply, again, by pushing them up to their perceived limits. I'd say just beyond their perceived limits. It's only against your perceived limits will you actually discover that you actually do have one more in the tank that you can offer up one more time at that decisive time and at that decisive place. Marines want it hard and they want it demanding and are disappointed when it's not. They may gripe once when the training's underway, but they'll be telling stories about it for years afterwards. One thing about being a Marine is that history is almost like a religion, right? Marines are proud of their affiliation and they hold their unit's lineage in high esteem. You can actually use the unit's history, its heritage, right, to be able to incorporate what I call will training into our skill training. As I mentioned, we are very comfortable with building training plans that improve physical fitness, tactical proficiency, et cetera. But we need to take a more deliberate effort of incorporating this will training into our skill training. And you can do this by incorporating historical examples. Marines, again, want to be worthy successors to the lineage that's being passed down. Now, if it's hard and it's a pain in the ass, make sure you're the first in line. Remember, that's how Stockdale was able to impart, the Stoic philosophy. It wasn't through preaching. It wasn't through giving lectures. It was through his personal example. People do what people see. Finally, check your emotional hygiene. Just like cheer will resonate through the organization, so too if the boss has a case of the ass. Make sure that, before you interact with your Marines, you've cleaned up any emotional hygiene you have so you don't bring your bad attitude or your despair onto your Marines. It will resonate with them. Take caution of what you're actually communicating with your Marines and your soldiers, especially in a crisis. Now, how do you acquire that consistency of character that will make it impervious for others to do you harm? Well, I started off by talking about Stockdale and the invincible man. Remember that invincible man is he who cannot be dismayed by those things happening outside of his control. Instead of invincible, the part I want you to focus on, though, is the ability to distinguish between happenings outside of your control. The key is they may have been broken under torture. They may have given up some secret information. They may have turned in one of their fellow POWs. They were not Superman, but they did not break fundamentally as people and were able to endure years of prison of captivity with dignity. In that sense, they were invincible. Now, as I wrap up a 30-year career, I can attest that success, it's never satisfying. If your work is to serve yourself and advance yourself professionally, you will never be satisfied. But that intrinsically compelling vocation is not found looking within. But as Viktor Frankl taught us, it's our ability to be able to find our passion by asking, what is life asking for us? I suggest you begin with that spiritual health assessment and ask, what kind of military professional do I want to be? The choice between a quest for status and a search for real achievement is before us every day. Now, this is a difficult time for our nation, but I believe that any lack of resilience and resolve and the moral failings we are witnessing today are not due to a weakness of this generation, but due to an inadequate example. We in the military are not immune from the strife that is dividing our society. As leaders, we must find a way to set ourselves apart and buttress our military ethos. I think Stoicism here offers a great alternative. I'll leave Stockdale's quote there for you to ponder. Now, lastly, I promised Franklin that I would share some of the readings here that I included some of my lectures. As mentioned, if you're looking for some great history to incorporate into your will, to incorporate will into your skill training, I recommend you pull any one of Stephen Pressfield's books. If you're not familiar with Stephen Pressfield, he's a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel and historian. Now, he writes historical fiction. I'm reminded by my PhDs all the time that these are not historically accurate, but I will tell you they will resonate with your soldiers. They will resonate with your Marines. There's some great examples there that you can pull and incorporate into your discussions with your soldiers and your Marines. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the works of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. You may not be familiar with Stockdale's book, The Philosophical Thoughts of a Fighter Pilot. This book is actually just a series of his lectures and his writings, and it's just full of Stoic pearls of wisdom. Really excited to hear Donald Robertson talk about his book. I don't think I need to get in front of him, but I would recommend you take a look at Grossman's book on killing and Primal Leadership on Emotional Intelligence. This has been a great opportunity for me. I look forward to any discussions you may have. With this, I will then stop with the asynchronous lecture, and most importantly, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on how we can incorporate Stoicism into the military to help build that resiliency and resolve. And thanks for your time.